Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy, and this is a special series on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people. Today, I am beyond delighted to be joined by my friend James Docherty from Glasgow. How are you, James?
I'm good, Jane, thanks.
Well, James, I met you a few years ago now in West Lothian at a screening of Resilience, the documentary about childhood adversity. But before we talk about trauma and what we need to do to, I suppose, prevent it in the first place and help people heal, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your own background, James, please?
So I've got quite a colourful background, Jane. So I grew up in an alcoholic home. I experienced poverty growing up. Grew up in domestic abuse. Also experienced the children's panel system and went through the care system, through the juvenile prison system, into the adult prison system, and basically cycled in the justice system for about 9 years of my life before I get the opportunity to get a chance to look at the reasons why I'd ended up in that lifestyle in the first place. And basically that's where my journey started to where I'm at now. So now, today, I work in the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit, and I've been there full time 8 years, I think, nearly, and I've had a relationship with the VRU for about 11. I was a volunteer with them first, and I've worked with young people and children's for one of the biggest children's charities in Britain on youth diversion schemes, and I also work with the Community Justice Scotland in an advisory role. So I'm there 1 day a week and I'm 4 days a week at the Violence Reduction Unit. And as you know, the Violence Reduction Unit look at violence through the public health lens. So it's about dosing down the violence in our culture by any means possible, but primarily through the public health lens.
Okay, thanks, James. And so you're also a major figure in the Ace Aware Nation movement in Scotland, which I've personally found so inspirational because it's a grassroots movement. It has, yes, experts from various fields, but it's also very bottom-up driven, I think.
Yeah.
And can you tell me, when did you first hear about ACEs and trauma?
About 16 years ago.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So about 16 years ago, I landed in therapy. Long story short, I had made a decision that I needed to make some changes in my life, and I found myself in therapy. And in therapy, I was diagnosed with CPTSD, and I had to do some work, my own work, about trauma. And I had no idea, Jane, I had absolutely no idea about how trauma had impacted my life. And then when I left therapy, one of the things that got me, I remember sitting in therapy, Jane, and they told me I needed to look at my anger. They effectively told me that my anger was going to kill me. That
Right.
was what they said. So they said, you need to deal with your anger, James, it's going to kill you.
Mm.
And what I didn't realise was that my anger was a coping mechanism. And they basically told me to watch this video. So that's how long ago it was. It was an actual cassette recorder of a video. And I remember playing this video, and the video was people sitting sharing their lived experience about how they experienced the family system growing up and where their defence mechanism of anger came from. And I remember this wee girl, well, it was a woman, and she was describing as a wee girl how her father was an alcoholic, and she used to sit with her nose against the window waiting on him coming home, and all she ever wanted for him when he came home from the pub was to just gather her in his arms and let her know she was needed, wanted and loved. And he never ever did it. And when she was recollecting the story, she would get pain in her nose, like her
Right.
nose was sore. And it blew my mind because I started to realise that the trauma was stored at a physiological level in the body, and how there was a young man on it as well who was describing how his father was a tyrant who was really, he was just terrified of his dad, and he grew up with a fierce disdain towards any form of authority, which I identified with.
Yeah.
And he basically said that it got that bad for him that he stood that he no stood sorry he was sitting in a car. My daughter just came in.
No worries.
It's okay. He sat in this car, Jane, and a truck pulled up in front of him, and he ended up in an altercation with the guy in the truck, and he said there was no way that my car was going to do anything to this truck. He went, but I just drove my car straight into the truck in a blind rage,
Yeah.
because it was his complete rage. It was just a rage towards authority, but it was a representation of his father, and it was about, and he's acting out the trauma. And I was like, so I started to, they were explaining stuff in a way that, why has nobody ever told me this stuff?
Yeah, yeah.
Why have I spent 9 years in the justice system, and I've arrived here in this place to get therapy, and they're exposing me to this information, which was so simple.
Mm.
And there was also a bit in the video where it described, it was through the lens of a child in the womb. So a child's in the womb, and it was the child listening to the environment,
Oh gosh, okay.
and it was through the child's ears and the child's perception from being in the womb, this video. And it was listening to the mother getting put down and the father domestically abusing her. And then the video described the hormonal release and how the child, that basically the cortisol and the adrenaline's going through the mum, and the child's feeling the mum's emotive response to what's happening in their environment. And the video gave the description of this child's heart rate going up because it was
In
experiencing
the
the stress of
womb.
the mother.
Wow.
And this was 16 years ago, Jane. And I remember sitting there going, oh my God, this is how big this affects children in the womb. And it was that profound for me that became a big part of my journey, was to heal and explore all that stuff. So when I left therapy, I was basically, I want to let people know about trauma. People need to know about how trauma is impacting people's lives and how it shapes their world view and alters their social perception, that everybody isn't the enemy,
Yeah.
that people have basically got these adaptations because of abnormal circumstances, and that it's not them it's abnormal, it was the circumstances they were living under, and their adaptations are normal coping mechanisms to abnormal circumstances. And if we don't understand that, we can fall into the trap of exacerbating it by punishing them, or any form of social exclusion will exacerbate that sense of separation that's at the core of trauma.
Sure. And in your years prior to finding out about this unbelievable revelation about what stress can do in the womb and beyond, and how it can make people enraged and maybe violent, had anyone, let's say in the prison system, kind of asked you what you were angry about?
Never,
No.
never. And we did anger management once when I was doing a long-term prison sentence, and I remember there was acknowledged, all they did was give me information, I felt, on the reality that I was angry and that I couldn't manage it sometimes. So it was almost like giving somebody who's got low self-esteem a book on why low self-esteem, not what they could do about it.
Yeah.
They gave us some tools, but fundamentally, Jane, I never had an anger problem. See, when I looked at it in depth, I had a fear problem.
Right.
My problem is fear. I was driven by fear. And at the core of it was an overactive stress response. It was a autonomic nervous system jammed for threat, waiting and threat happening anytime. And I was always trying to think one step ahead of any threat happening. So any chance of me being able to go and seek greater solutions like get a job, get an education, form healthy relationships were always limited because my brain was wired for just finding safety in the environment that I was living in. And it wasn't until I met John Carnican and Karen McCluskey who set up the Violence Reduction Unit. John had a wonderful quote that said, he said, if you grow up in a war zone, you become a warrior. And I said, he's right. He's right. Because you'll need the toolkit to survive that environment. If you put a healthy, psychologically and emotionally healthy human being and take him from a middle-class suburb and drop him in the middle of Helmand province, he's going to do what he needs to do to survive that environment. And he'll go against his moral compass to do that. Because his moral compass will not to kill, not to hurt other people. But if he feels that he needs to do that to maintain his own existence, then that's what they'll do. And that's what happens in war, as we know. Yeah. People go beyond what they wouldn't do under normal circumstances. And fundamentally, that's what I was trying to get people to understand about why young people were caught up in gang violence. It wasn't about the behaviour or the symptoms, which the behaviour is in the gang. It was about getting down to the causes and conditions, helping the individuals understand that, and then they could make better decisions over their life in regards to whether they want to enter in any form of healing or reparation.
It strikes me that the justice system has a major lack of understanding about survival, and that, like you say, if you're existing with life threats all around you, and you're primed for survival, then really even the rational part of the brain isn't all that accessible to us. And in terms of your work, though, with young men who might be involved in gang violence, how important is it for them to start to feel safe around other people and feel safe in their bodies around other people?
Yeah, it's massive, Jane. And that's why the Straight and Arrow project at the Violence Reduction Unit works so well, because we've created a safe environment and we've provided safe relationships. So it's fundamentally, if you look at, it's no use being trauma informed unless you're creating trauma and responsive and informed environments. So we looked at through the lens of, if we can create and provide the environment, and we can also provide the relationships that support people in the new environment. And what we found was that people just naturally started to move in a different direction, because we basically dosed down the stress in their life. And the more you dose down the stress in somebody who's got an overactive stress response, then the best chance the prefrontal cortex gets to come back online and take on new information. It's almost, and you'll know this as well, it's almost impossible to take in information and retain it when you're highly stressed. And it's why even police officers have got a debrief after a big incident. And some of them report they can't remember certain actions they took.
Yeah.
Because they weren't in that part of their brain.
Yeah, they were just trying to live through it to survive.
Totally. Yeah. Totally, and that's why you do a debrief, because it's part of the process of helping you process it and get regulated again, and getting people the support they might need. But a lot of people who are caught up in the justice system, they've never had a debrief.
Yeah.
And they've never had a chance to be regulated. Yeah. So they're just living at the autonomic nervous system all the time. And that's why...
Sorry, James. I was just going to say, and also our system is shaming and blaming. It's not really curious about the roots of behavior, or, it doesn't, often people in criminal courts don't have a chance to even speak. Their lawyer tells their story. So there's a kind of narrative entrapment where the story that's being maybe told about you does not tell the half of it. It's just talking about the symptoms and the outcomes of the stress response.
So it's did to you. It's another process for stuff's did to you. And the reason why it fails is because it doesn't fundamentally understand that at the core of all trauma is shame.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason shame's at the core of trauma is because usually if you're looking at it through the ACEs lens, in fact, you don't even need to look at it through the ACEs lens. If a child's experiencing adversity, there's a good chance it's because the adults who are charged with taking care of them in the world have failed that responsibility. So the child can only internalise it in one way. There must be something fundamentally wrong with me as a human being. There must be something unlovable and unlikable about me if the people who are supposed to take care of me are hurting me at this level and don't give me a voice. So then you take that child who's got the core belief of, I'm not good enough, and you put them in the justice system through, they're still responsible for their behaviour, Jane. It's never about taking people off the hook in regards to taking responsibility for their behaviour. But if you're not understanding that our process actually shame induces, it triggers people who are shame-based. But we've got a shame-based system. And two shame-based people don't make a healthy relationship.
No. Yeah. There's no repair there.
Never. Even if you look at payback orders, even that's shame-inducing. Why do they not call it a reparation?
Yeah. Indeed, and language is important.
Or a community inclusion order.
Great suggestion, yeah.
So it's still this notion of I need to be seen to be paying back, which is still through the punitive lens.
Yes, and also just from a cost effectiveness model, you know, because we've failed children and their families and their wider communities by ignoring all this trauma and adversity, then we end up paying a high economic cost by imprisoning lots of people and rendering them unable to work when there's so many kind of undiscovered talents.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely, Jane. And as you know, one adaptation of trauma is the need to seek relief for the trauma. So if you've got, and it's my own experience as well, that 11 years of age, I discovered a drug called cannabis, or hash. They called it hash back then. And that drug was so profound in its effect on me that I smoked it every day until I was 27. Well, that's a lie. There was periods where if I could have smoked it every day, I would have, if I had got my hands on it right. And the reason being is because cannabis is an analgesic, it's got painkiller properties, and it'll saturate an overactive stress response, so it'll give the individual relief. But we've got a law that tells me it's wrong to take that particular drug, so even that's shame-inducing.
Yeah.
But it's my attempt at a solution. It makes me feel better. But nobody ever looks at the wee guy smoking cannabis and says, I wonder what's going on in that wee guy's life that he needs to seek relief in a substance. What they'll say is if you keep smoking that, that's a gateway to this drug, that's a gateway to that drug, and you can't come in here if you do that. And it's fundamentally more exclusion, more shaming. Yeah. It's just layers and layers and layers and layers. And the justice system, as we know, is entrenched with addiction. And it'd be easy if it was just cannabis, but as we know, there's stronger painkillers in cannabis.
Indeed.
And at the core of addictions, shame as well.
And Dr. Gabor Mate, who's one of your favorites and mine too, he's a great phrase, we shouldn't ask why the addiction, but why the pain. Yeah. You and your friend Kim McGuigan organised a superb conference in Glasgow, the second ACE Aware Nation conference called ACEs into Assets. And Dr. Gabor Mate spoke at it. Can you tell me what was the focus of that event, James?
So, fundamentally, my thinking behind it was convincing testimony needs to come from medical people who get this problem. Because it was okay me saying, here's my experience, here's my lived experience perspective of this, and here's my professional perspective of it. But it needs the whole of the community to be shining a light on this particular problem. And I just thought that Gabor, in just the way he describes the human condition, how people experience parenting, how people experience certain systems, I just think he's the best that I've ever heard.
Yeah, he's
in
amazing.
regards to how he can articulate it. And I love his take on addiction. And the reason I love his take on addiction is because when I went into therapy, what took me into therapy, Jane, was I wanted to stop taking painkillers that I got addicted to in prison that weren't prescribed by the prison, which is not anybody's fault because that's just the way it was. So I'm not looking to blame or shame anybody. It's just not my thing. It's just the search for understanding. And it was in there that I found out that, the treatment centre told me that addiction was genetic and it was in the genes, and I wasn't satisfied with that answer.
Right.
And the reason I wasn't satisfied with it, Jane, was because, one, I've got a child.
Okay.
I had at the time I've got a 2-year-old wee girl, and she's a big driving force behind. She's the major driving force. Plus, I want to get better as well, but she's the major driving force behind the reason why I want to recreate my life, because I want to give this wee girl a chance at growing up in an environment where she's not exposed to the chaos I was, right? And here I was getting told this information, but it was kind of stealing the hope away. I was like, what if my wee girl's got this?
Yeah.
So I delved into studying it, and what I started to realise is that it was more environmental than it was genetic. And even if it was 90% genetic and it was 10% environmental, then the 10% is the only bit I could do something about, and that was my responsibility. So I was going to pour all my attention in there. But it's actually greater than that. Now, the genetic link it's not even worth mentioning.
Yeah.
In regards to the evidence base behind it. And that kind of led me to Gabor's work. So when I discovered Gabor, I was like, finally a doctor who's talking sense about addiction. And he's speaking for the perspective. He's not got lived experience as such as being chemically dependent. But it just blew my mind that this guy who hadn't been chemically dependent could understand addiction the way he did. And that, for me personally, I don't think there's anybody better. There's certain things I don't. There's certain things, like, I don't agree with everything he says, the same as I don't agree with everything anybody else says, and the same as I don't expect everybody to agree with everything I say.
Sure.
But it doesn't mean that if there's a part of what he says I don't agree with, I just dismiss his whole argument. And that's the same for anybody else that I listen to.
He's a very kind of compassionate approach, I suppose, to understanding addiction too, and the woundedness and his accounts of, say, the sufferings of Native Canadians, down through time, and the disproportionate impact it's had there. But also he's fascinating about attachment, I think, and how it's not just enough to look at, say, the abuse and neglect, or living with someone with a mental illness or an incarcerated relative. It's connection, or the absence of connection, what Bruce Perry calls relational poverty. Do you agree that that's a significant thing, whether it's in addiction or trauma more generally, James?
Absolutely. The solution to the whole of the human condition becomes, when it's about the disconnect for self, is about relationships. It's about emotionally available, safe, attuned, available relationships. Because my experience is, Jane, if a guy like me who's as deeply wounded as I was, with some of the adaptations to that trauma that I had, can get well and become a productive, law-abiding, responsible, emotionally available, caregiving father, and a member of the community where people are looking at him as if this boy's got an answer to some of this stuff. And
Yeah.
rather than the way I was looked at, if you to go to the community I grew up in and ask people, do you think James would be where he is today? Based on what they knew of me, they would have been like, no chance.
Yeah.
No chance. So if you cut me in half, I've got underdog syndrome. I've got that thing where don't write people off, because I've seen cases where, and my own experience is the same. But what I also say is, because people say to me, Jane, what is it about you? But where did you get that inner strength? Where did you get this? And I've had people saying to me, but you've got an inner strength, James. You've got that. Maybe I have. Maybe I have. Maybe I had that inner drive to, that sense of there must be something past this. Because I did have that. Because a lot of my friends never made it. But it's no discounting their ability not to make it just because they might not have had that. Because there's no doubt in my mind, Jane, I would not be having this conversation with you if it wasn't for relationships.
Yeah.
So even though the willingness came for me to want to do something about it, if I never got the relationships that were provided to me, I wouldn't have been able to go on a different path, because the relationships are fundamentally what took me in a different path.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, it makes perfect sense, because we need to be seen and heard and appreciated and loved. And you mentioned love in your ACEWare Nation speech.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned that Karen McCluskey and John Carnican were kind of attachment figures when you started out in the Violence Reduction Unit. Can you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean by that?
So the first time I heard Karen and John, there was a part of me that was just like, they care about young people. I just knew that they cared about young people. They cared about the plight of young people who are caught in the cycle of gang violence. They cared about preventing they cared about everybody. They just gave that sense of, what can we do as a community to stop these young people hitting each other with knives, so that I don't need to go to a mum's door and say, your son isn't coming home tonight because he's in the morgue, or say to another son, your son isn't coming home tonight because I've arrested him for murder, because it's the same look in both the mums' faces. And I just at my core knew that they actually cared, and time has actually proven that to be the fact that they do care, because they still do what they've done fair way back then. And it wasn't as if they showed up and they never gave me a pep talk or a motivational speech, or here's a session plan for you, or here's a criteria. Here's a criteria for knowing us. They were just doing relationship. They were walking their talk.
Yeah.
And I just get that sense of, I started listening to them. I hung off for every word in that, and I kind of just copied them. But not copied them as in like stole their stuff, but just
modeled. You started model, or they modeled the behavior, and you kind of.
Absolutely. So they were unconsciously modelling expectations to me, and it took me in a different journey. So what I mean with attachment figures, as in, like, Carl McCluskey has never ever gave me directions when I've asked for her advice, gave me advice on something I've never had a positive, healthy outcome, ever, and neither has John. And I've always sought their guidance when I needed it, but primarily it's they basically modelled to me what I needed to be in the world. Because bearing in mind, Jane, I'm showing up, so I'm the first person with offending history to be attached to a police unit at the time and working with them.
Oh, is that right? I didn't realise you were the very first, right?
So it blew my mind, because I was like, why do these people even care about me? Because I've still got that core thing where, why are these people showing up? But the human condition responds to that.
Yes.
I also had a mentor in the community as well, a guy called Tam, who always encouraged me to follow my heart. He knew I cared about young people, and he knew I cared about trying to raise the awareness of the trauma that they might be carrying. And he always says to me, just follow your heart, run, mate, and see where it takes you, son. Some of the best advice I've ever had, like, run, mate, son, see where it takes you. rather than getting that, oh, you're too early on the journey, you need a qualification here,
Right.
you need this,
Yeah.
you need that, and all that. He was just like, run, mate, see where it takes you. If it didn't work out, he was like, it's cool, something else will come up. And that's what happened. But it was a slog, Jane. It was a real slog. At times it was a lonely business because I detached for the whole lifestyle. I walked away for the whole lifestyle. So I'd basically walked away for just all the guys that I used to hang around with. I basically just renounced the whole lifestyle, like no judgment or anything. It was just like, guys, I'm out.
Yeah.
And they were like, what do you mean you're out? I went, I'm done with all this. There'll be no more drug dealing, there'll be no more drugs, there'll be no more alcohol. I'm out, there'll be no more violence or conflict for me. I basically made the statement that I'm done. I was walking away for the whole thing.
And they were okay with that, were they? They kind of went, off you go, James. Happy for you.
Some of them are probably glad to see the back of me, Jane.
But I mean, that's
them,
a key thing about assistance, I think, is that sometimes you have to knife off, as Shad Maruna says, and kind of take yourself out of the toxic environment and try and surround yourself with pro-social people. But I guess that's the lonely part. How do you get to know them?
Yeah, and the lonely bit was forming new relationships.
Yeah.
And it's the very thing that I'm terrified of doing. Because relationships have never ever went well for me. No meaning intimate relationships,
Yeah.
I'm meaning just through the context of relationships altogether. But I went into 12-step recovery, and that's almost like a community within a community. So even being in Alcoholics Anonymous, now I don't make any secret of like my life's just like, this is a part of my journey, this is who I am, right? So there's no shame about I'm in recovery or I experienced addiction or trauma. It's like nobody can hold power over me with that because I stand in the light of who I am.
Yes.
So being in the recovery community was big for me because even people in there became attachment figures. And I hung off their every word, and they taught me and gave me new tools on how to come at life, which is why I laugh when we think we need a trauma specialist to go in and resolve all this trauma these people are carrying. I'm like, fundamentally, Jane, most of my trauma was resolved with walking with people who were trying to solve their own particular life problems or had distance away from solving theirs. And a lot of it was people in the recovery community who never knew anything about trauma or trauma-informed practice. They were just living by the spiritual principles of the 12-step process, which is fundamentally at its core about relationships. So they were telling me, 2 seconds, darling.
Is that
That's Darcy.
Darcy, who I met before? Hi, Darcy. Hi. I met you before in Glasgow. You've gotten so big. You're a gorgeous girl.
Can you get the door, please?
No.
Why not?
I must just get my charger, James. 1 sec.
Right, okay.
Don't get the door, Dad.
Run down, Darcy. You're going to miss it. It's a parcel. Run, quick.
No, you don't
I can't. I'm busy, darling.
Please, I don't want it.
He's away. It's too late. Your big sister's in the house.
No.
Well, she could have got it.
She's gotten very big and grown up. Beautiful.
I know, she's a wee cracker. So where was I? Aye. So fundamentally, it's about relationship. So there was a saying in 12-step recovery, they used to say, James, stick with the winners.
Okay.
I didn't like it because it meant there was losers, and I don't like the fact, I don't like that polar, oh, there must be losers if they're winners, or good and bad, or...
And what did they mean by that?
Stick with the winners is stick with the people in recovery who are living by the principles of the 12-step process. That's right. So you need to ask them to explain it, because I've got lots of wee throwaway statements in recovery where they would say things and they wouldn't give it any context. So me being me, I'm always like, I'm curious, so I'd be like, explain that. And he would say, well, see him over there, or him there, or him there. They've been here a long time doing this stuff. Stick with them.
They're solid.
Yeah, they're solid. And you'll notice that yourself, Jane, when you meet people who have got recovery, they're just straight down the line.
Yeah,
'Cause
there's
they need to
something
be.
very
The life could-
powerful about it, and the forthrightness, and the support. You know, people like that who are in it a long time, the way they go out on a limb for people. And I suppose that's the atonement quality as well, having maybe done harmful things to other people, the making reparations and being of service is amazing, really.
Yeah.
And it's
That blew
sometimes,
my mind.
I think it sort of sometimes makes me think of the deficiencies in frontline services then that are 9 to 5, you know, and never available when people need them. And it's like, well, that's above my pay grade, or I can't be dealing with that, you know.
Yeah.
So
chaos isn't a 9 to 5, as you know.
It's not a 9 to 5 at all. It tends to be completely out of hours, I think, you know, and on holidays. But
that's what I noticed about these people. I remember I was 3 months sober, and I was in my grand's, and my uncle started arguing with my other uncle, and I just knew it was a bad idea for me to be in that environment. They were drunk, they were arguing about a family resentment for 25 years ago, they were criticising my brother, and I phoned my mentor and I said, Tam, I need to get out of here. And he says, tell me what's happening, son. I told him what was happening. And he went, right, I'll come and get you. And he drove, basically, this was at a time when Glasgow had a snowfall. It was about 6 feet deep, and it lay for about 3 weeks, about 11 years ago. And he drove through that snow and blizzards, about 30. So it was like probably a 40, 45 mile round trip to go and get me, and took me back to his mentor's home, and they let me into their home, and I was just totally overwhelmed that these people who didn't even know me were letting me into their home for Christmas dinner. And I was in a homeless unit, and I was 3 months sober, and I was estranged from my family at the time, and I was just overwhelmed with this sense of this is what I want my family home to be like for my girls, and now my wee boy as well. And they never at any point, so this was like 8 o'clock at night. No, they weren't doing a risk assessment, they were doing a compassion assessment. It was like a compassion assessment. It was just like, right, the right thing to do here is just go and get them.
Yeah, grab the keys and go there. And I suppose
just took me right out of
what was happening there for you, obviously, was your nervous system was overwrought from the tension all around you. And then to go from that into this contained, safe kind of buffering environment must have been kind of strange but wonderful.
It was fascinating. I do understand now that alcoholics are dead vulnerable to relapse if they're too stressed. So they knew leaving me in there was risky. So they came and got me out. So my stress response was just like, here. And then they took me into an environment where everybody was regulated, and it was just like the best way to describe it was like a loving, connected family home where their children were in the house, and they let me sit and eat Christmas dinner, and then some of them played songs on their guitars, and it's one of the best Christmases I've ever had, to be honest.
Yeah.
But it's going through that highly stressful situation into a calm space. That's why it's so strong and kept in my memory.
But to go back to relationships again, it's kind of, it brings that saying that we are the medicine to mind. It's like and you finished your talk in Glasgow in 2018 with, we belong to each other. And I don't think most of us know that. You know, we feel we belong to our families or our friends maybe, but that we don't necessarily belong to strangers or people we don't really know. And it's such an amazing thing to actually know the power we can have in one another's lives, I think, for good.
Totally.
If we just open.
That's where I get it from, Jane. It was that sense of these people, they were calling me son.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it is. It's like getting called son by somebody that doesn't even know you. It's like endearing.
Yeah.
Like I felt as if at some level I belonged to them, and they were giving me that sense that you do belong to us, and you're look at you.
Yeah.
Like there was a woman in in the recovery fellowship used to like kiss both my cheeks.
Yeah.
And she didn't even know me, and she would hold my shoulders and she would say, "Look at you, you're an unfinished work of art."
Oh, beautiful.
And I'd be like, part of you
Makes
loves
a
it, and part of
change.
you is like, no.
Yeah. But beautiful. Everyone needs to kind of hear that, especially when
Absolutely.
they haven't maybe heard those kind of things too much in the past.
Yeah.
Do you think as a dad now that you can kind of tell your children that you love them or snuggle them and hug them and stuff enough?
Constantly.
Yeah.
Constantly. My youngest daughter, I was bringing her home, and she sits in the front of my bike. So I take her on my mountain bike. She's got her own wee seat at the front. And when she was driving, she turned her head with her lips puckered. She's wanting me to kiss her while I'm driving.
A bit dangerous, but lovely.
I was just like, I love my children. Like, absolutely adore every hair in their head. And they're the most precious things I've got in my life, my children. And I think a big part of why I'm that way with my children is my own life experience, but also the knowledge and the insight and the awareness I've got round about adverse childhood experiences. That's totally fundamentally changed the way I parent. Was realising like you've only got one shot to get the nurture needs met when they're young, and then it sets them in pretty much a good way for the rest of their life.
Yeah, which is a bit terrifying. And yet we need to remember that even those who didn't have the most nurturing start can kind of flower once they're shown a bit of nurturing. So that in a sense,
and that's why I know it works, Jane, because because the people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, the people who loved me, I was able to love myself, were people who were once in that experience. As much as I needed to go to a hospital, which is where I did go to get the therapy that I got and get the treatment for the painkiller addiction, and that was needed. I needed to go to society to get that done, and I could do another podcast on the reasons behind that, but fundamentally what sustained it and what maintains it was the relationships at the community level. It was the recovery community, it was John Carnican, it was Cam McCluskey, it was the police officers in the unit, it was the woman at the job centre who, when I told her my plight, she was like, "Oh my God," she had this sense of, "I want to help you," probably over and above what I would really want to do, because you've told me a wee bit about your life and how you struggle to get a job because you've got a history of previous convictions, and it bars you against some types of employment because of the violence I was caught up in and the gang fighting when I was young. It was just like, it was almost as if at times, that's why it was lonely as well, because I was saying things to Cam like, it feels as if society doesn't want me back. It's like, it felt as if it was too late for me. I wanted to work with young people, but the only industry that seemed to be accepting of me was the construction industry. And that's where I felt I'd be least effective.
Yes.
Because that wasn't where my passion lay. I could scaffold, I could do rope access, but my passion was in wanting to navigate young people away from the justice system or put in the preventions that stop them going there in the first place. because I fundamentally believe, Jane, that you can prevent addiction, you can prevent the mental health issues we see, and we can prevent crime and criminality. There's no doubt in my mind that it can be prevented.
And from your experience, James, with the VRU and from your own lived experience, like, is poverty the main cause of crime and violence, or is trauma, or is it a kind of particularly combustible, dangerous combination of the two of them?
Yeah, it's the combination. It's the perfect storm. Poverty, as Aristotle says, is a parent of crime. So Aristotle said that a long time ago, and Aristotle was right, but Aristotle didn't understand trauma and the poverty of relationships, or maybe he did. I've not delved into his work enough, but fundamentally for me, poverty may be the parent of crime, as Aristotle's saying. But I've been to countries, like, I spent some time in Peru, sitting in a village in the jungle with kids who were playing football with their bare feet. Their clothes were hanging off them. They were living in absolute poverty, but they were some of the most beautiful, connected, emotionally available kids I've ever seen in my life. That normally you look at a kid and you can just see the light on behind their eyes.
That's
and you're
right.
like this. And you can look at kids who are experiencing trauma and they're dead behind the eyes. And that's because the light has to go, because of what they're experiencing. But what I noticed in this village was they were always surrounded with adults, Jane. They weren't experiencing the poverty of relationship. And I never felt more safe in a strange country than I did in that jungle. They could have took me into the jungle and I might never have been seen again. But at no part of the whole process did I feel as if I was in any danger. I felt cared for and looked totally. And I've got a built-in radar for knowing when things aren't safe. It's like my hypothalamus is overdeveloped in the sense of that's where being streetwise comes from. Like, we need to get out of here. It isn't a good feeling. We need to go, because you get that sense there's going to be something happening. And the person who hasn't been in that experience is saying things to me like, do you think you're overreacting a bit? And then I'm like, no, let's go. And then we hear later on something happened. And that's basically even as simple as we're sitting in a park one day and I says to my friends, we need to leave here. There's a bad feeling here. I think something's going to happen in this park. And we got up and left. And then there was a police report a few days later that said there was a running fight in this park with young people with bottles in one of the parks down my area. And I picked up on it. I picked up on the shift. And I picked up on this, just the shift of energy in the environment. And I just says to my friends, let's go. And they were like, how do you know that stuff? And I'm like, I don't know.
Lived it for too long.
Know.
But and this is the other interesting thing, is about when you understand trauma, you realize that actually that is a highly adaptive response when you live in a dangerous environment. You know, that to have that exaggerated startle response, or also to be hypervigilant, will keep you alive when being snoozy will not. You know, when you feel too safe and you're not on the lookout, bad things might happen. But over time,
that's its function. It kept me alive, Jane. That's kept me alive. I've no doubt in my mind. It's kept me alive. That's got me out of situations that I shouldn't have got out.
Yeah. And do you think that recovery and healing are the same thing, or are there differences, or do some people just prefer one word and not the other, James?
Say that again, you went and cut
off. Sorry.
There.
Do you think that healing and recovery are the same thing? Or do, you know, some people prefer, recovery is more the word in addiction and mental health, I think. But some people talk about healing from trauma.
When people I guess it's personal preference. And for me, recovery implies that it's not lost. So I love the word recovery because it implies it's not lost. You're just going back to get it.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it isn't lost? Your essence, who you are at your core. And I believe in deep down inside every man, woman and child is a part of them that's unwoundable, that you can't wound. And it's getting people back in touch with that, who they are, who they are at their core. And it's a journey, as you know. Healing's a journey, and healing's messy. There's times where I've thought, I've got this licked. That's me. I've recovered. I'm a miracle of mental health.
Yeah.
And then before I know it, something happens in my life situation, or I'm carrying too much of a workload, or I'm not doing enough of my self-care, and I start to feel as if my problems are piling up on me.
Okay.
Or as recently as far back as when the pandemic kicked off, because I've got PTSD, I always run the risk of being triggered because of the way PTSD is stored in the human mind. And it can be the most inconspicuous thing. You're like, even a smell.
Yeah, it's a big
and
one.
before you know it, I'm dissociating. And you can miss large chunks a day because you've been dissociated. So it's just something you get better at living with. But I do believe you can heal and recover, and that there isn't a limitation. And
No.
that's why I named the conference, the Gabor Mate conference, Aces to Assets, because I will not stand for people looking at me or anybody else who's experienced trauma through a lens of adversity as if they're limited, that there's limitations on them, or there's a vulnerability, let's tiptoe around them. Or don't do this because they might drink, or don't do that because, or they're not up to the job because of this. And starting to get people to look at the care experienced, which include myself in that bracket, people who've experienced the justice system, as people who are actually assets in your community. They're no deficits, so don't look at them through a deficit lens ever. We hate it.
Of course.
It's the worst thing you can do to a person that's experienced trauma.
But even no doubt at your most angry and volatile, you were more things than those things too. You know, you had other qualities, I'm sure, because like you're so eloquent and interesting. I'm sure you were also eloquent. Maybe you were talking about different things and at different priorities, but you were always smart.
Do you know something, Jane? My friend died in a motorway last week. So he found himself in the hospital and decided to walk home from the hospital and I think he tried to take a shortcut across the motorway and he got hit with a car and it killed him. And when I was about 16, 17, maybe younger than that, he used to say to me, James, you would be a brilliant social worker. And I'd be like, so I had social workers and I was like, what? And he's like, you've just got a fantastic way of explaining things. So even back then when I was young, I always thought dynamically. I looked straight down into the core of situations and why I believed it happened, rather than just taking it at face value. And he spotted that. He said to me, "You'd be a good social worker," as in, because I was always good at holding people.
Yeah. And did you have the kind of emotional intelligence and ease with expressing emotions then? I suspect not, somehow. Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
My father said to my therapist, part of the therapy they looked at was family dynamics. So they speak to your parents to get a deeper understanding of what was James like when he was young and blah, 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 the family dynamics. And they did family therapy, which only my dad participated in. My mum never showed up. And the therapist came back to me and said, I asked your dad what you were like when you were young, and your dad said that I was deep as a Clyde and twice as wide. And he went, what do you mean? He went, he didn't tell Andy nothing. And he says to him, as he never spoke about like this particular subject. My dad said, listen, he does not speak to anybody about nothing. And
Wow.
he's been that way since he was a wee boy. And I've never met anybody like him in my life. He's a closed book, which I'm now the polar opposites, almost as if
Yes.
I've got that.
But
So
that is fascinating, and yet not surprising, in a sense that, like, if you had opened up, if you'd said anything, how would you contain the pain or the rage or the anger either, you know, and the sadness, I guess, and the grief.
yep.
But I've met you in real life a few times, and I've had dinner and lunch with you and brunch, I think. And you've always struck me as remarkably gentle, you know, and I could listen to you all day and all night, much like Gabor. But, you know, these days, do you get angry?
Yeah, I get angry. Not as much. I'm never really in anger, wrong. Most of my anger's about injustice. If
Right.
I've got this injustice streak, it's usually when I see harnics happening, or I'm perceiving maybe stigma, or people not getting a fair hearing.
Mm-hmm.
I might even include myself in that bracket, but anger's healthy now. So it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't turn to resentment, and it doesn't turn
Yes.
to bitterness, and it doesn't turn to damaging relationship. So I express anger in a healthy way, but
Yeah.
I don't get angry that much, Jane, to
Yeah.
be honest.
And I suppose that's the same for any of us, understanding the causes of anger. And sometimes anger is, again, there to protect us, or to
Yeah.
perhaps in your youth was to get people to stay away, you know, to keep you safe by having an explosive outburst or something,
Yeah,
to repel people.
totally. So it bypassed boundary setting. I just went straight to wrath.
Yeah.
So as soon as it would just be wrath, and it would just be that force, where it just be like, you stay there, that's where you stay, don't cross that line. And I realised now, like, I've got compassion for myself. I needed to be that way to keep wee
Yeah.
James safe because of the stuff that happened to me. And that's why I get young people, I understand them, and they're in that rage. I get it. I'm like, it's try to protect yourself. That's the toolkit you need to survive the environment you're in. But we'll learn new tools, don't worry about it. And they're like, why do you know this stuff? Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, listen, you're never alone with what you think you're experiencing. You're not the only person this is happening to. And I guess I don't guess, I know that's at the core of trauma, that feeling of difference.
Yeah.
And that's
A
the theme song of young
disconnection.
people. My case is different. It's all right for you. You don't know what it's like for me. And that's why lived experience are brilliant at helping them.
I
Because
agree.
they know what it's like. And they can't, and they bring that credibility that other people who've not had that experience might struggle to bring. It doesn't mean they're not brilliant at their job, or I don't care who's doing it. Can you provide the relationship this wee person needs? Can you provide the relationship this girl needs or this guy needs? And if you can't, then get out of the way and let somebody that can. And don't get stuck in that, no, it's my job as a service and I'm the only one tasked with this role, because they ain't going to get it.
No. But the other thing is, I think, like, I'm just trying to imagine if I was a young lad who's involved in violent gang behavior and terrified, but also terrifying, then it's hopeful to meet someone who's also been through it, you know, rather than a middle class lady probation officer who hasn't a clue except from what she's learned, you know, who hasn't walked that walk. Do you think, say, when you engage with people, and Kevin Neary as well, you know, who also does great work, and there are many more, Callum in the Violence Reduction Unit, when you guys talk to people and maybe disclose bits and pieces of your own story, does that have a particular type of power, do you think, for filling a young person maybe with the sense, well, if he can do it, then maybe I can too?
Yeah, it cuts through the feeling of difference. Just cuts right through it to that place of, I'm no longer alone with this. These guys have been where I've been and have solved the problem. They know what it's like. They get me. Bessel van der Kolk's got a brilliant saying that said that the core of trauma has not been seen, and not been known. So if somebody comes along who's solved the particular problem that you're in, you get seen and known.
Yes.
There's
How
no
beautiful.
wriggle room.
Yeah, amazing. All right. And do you think that the community in general has more of a role to play in preventing trauma and adversity and then helping people to recover, to heal in its aftermath, James?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, fundamentally, the community is a solution. And it's the jobs of services to empower the communities to recognise that fundamentally they are the solution to most of the social ills that are out there. That's why I love the ACE Aware movement, because people were talking about what was happening in the house. And I know that it's a fireside out solution. It's all right talking about the gang fighting in the community, but why did the young people find themselves there? Because I know kids don't join gangs, Jane. They're always escaping something. If you've got kids in a gang who are peer orientating and the peers have become the attachment figures that they're taking guidance from, then what's happened to the adult relationships in their life? Why have they broken down? And how do we support? How does the community recognise and reclaim the youth that are getting lost to the peer culture? And that's why the community is so important. But the community get angry at the behaviour, and the behaviour are symptoms. So how do you hold the community in their resentment? And how do you process that with a community and allow them the space where they can discharge the resentment and get to the place of, right, I've got rid of that, I've got rid of that, I've got space now for understanding, and create that dynamic where you're getting the awareness into the community, like these young people need you. And that standing, we've seen it, standing in a community hall saying the police need to jail them, somebody needs to beat them up, or
kick them out, kick out the family, maybe.
No, it's usually three things. It's the police should sort it, or social work should sort it, and the parents need to get a grip of themselves. And then you get the odd one that'll be like, it's a good beating they need.
Right.
And what they're not realising is that social work and the police are the last line in any service. And that nobody's going to pull a lever and the police will fix it and or the social work will fix it. The community need to realise their role in it, what's going on and what their role in it is. And once they understand the plight of young people, I've never met a community member who the light bulbs went and they've went, oh, these Waynes. And they get that thing where they start to invent wise actions to try and support them because they realise the adversity they're facing, but still hold them accountable at the same time. That's why it takes a community to return you to your, it takes a community to return you to yourself, and that's why I'm saying we need to remember we all belong to each other because we're starting to forget.
And sometimes, though, I think that it can be hard for the community to be maybe empathetic to parents as well who are struggling and maybe behaving in awful ways, you know, where they're being violent or abusive to the children or just chronically neglecting them. But don't we really need to try and help them too, or support them and understand them? Because if the adults can change and if they can heal or recover, or as you say, know about ACEs and what it does. Like most parents, I don't think want to destroy their children.
No chance, totally. A lot of the harm's done unwittingly. So it's recognising that ACEs don't happen in a vacuum. So if you've got kids experiencing it, then they're coming usually from a family system who's experienced the intergenerational cycle of trauma that comes from experiencing adverse childhood experience, and that lack of buffering or mitigating relational support that you usually get for the community. A lot of the times it's the uncles, the grannies, the kinship carers, the aunties who are buffering the stress of what a family system's experiencing. And if you totally alienate any human being, they just get angry and rebellious at the perceived injustice of it all. And that's why you get young people who are just totally at war with the community. The Africans haven't got proverbs like if a children doesn't feel the worth of a community, they'll burn it to feel its worth. Something like that. I can't remember it word for word, but I get that statement. I know what it means.
Yeah.
If you feel alienated in your own community and everybody's always pointing the finger at you, then any attention's better than none.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, which is a sad state of affairs. I've taken a heap of your time, and I could, as I say, listen to you all day and all night and into next week probably. But final question, James, because this podcast is on the topic of how to talk policy and influence people, are there specific areas of public policy that you would like to see addressed in Scotland kind of urgently?
One of the things I would like to see in shaping policy is getting people who have lived the experience of who the policy is meant to serve. So any policy that doesn't understand the fundamental relationships is always doomed to fail. So the policy needs to point to relationships. And a lot of the people shaping the policy, it looks great on paper. And the strategy looks brilliant on how to implement it. But it will always fail at delivery if there isn't an understanding of the relationship. And some of the best people at shaping that policy, in fact, the policy makers need to be able to move to the place of humility, Jane, where it's like, right, we need to include members of the community that this policy is supposed to serve and start exploring it with them in regards to, would this work? Why would it not work? And what could we do different to make it work?
Yeah, proper co-production of public policy.
Yes, absolutely. It need to be. Because I look at some of the policy and I'm like, no chance. It's no chance. And some of the policy, if I could shape it today, would be how we address addiction in the justice system. Well, the justice system, it fails miserably at addressing addiction is because it's looking at it through the lens of a crime. So the justice system is a deficit model. So it's built on the premise you did something wrong and we're going to punish you for it. Now, if the addiction's made up, if the justice system's fundamentally made up with a high population of people who are addicted, then we need to look at community disposals that allow people to get well in the community, because it's not happening in.
Dad, your friend's here.
Tell me to go in the gym, I'll be 5 minutes, right?
No, it's not someone for the gym. It's your friend in the big van who takes you around that group.
I know, tell him to park and go in the van in 2 minutes in the gym.
I'm sorry, James. I've kept you for so long. She's a great custodian anyway and hostess. But
just gets me told.
Yeah,
my oldest daughter's meant to be watching her.
Oh, very good.
So go back to that question. If I could change anything in policy, it'd be how we address trauma and addiction in the justice system, and get the policymakers to realise, to wake up effectively to the realisation that you'll never punish trauma or addiction into a better way of being.
Dad, he's not well, he can't train.
Right, that's cool. Tell him I'll phone him.
When?
10 minutes.
Okay, he needs to wait down there.
We're finished now, Darcy. Don't worry, we're finished.
Look, Darcy, I'm getting recorded.
I know, but he's gonna.
I love that dress, Darcy. It's very Christmassy and beautiful. You're a lovely girl.
Teeth fell out, look.
Oh, wow. Those are 2 missing teeth for Christmas. Excellent. You're a gorgeous girl. Look, James, we can just leave it there. We've done a wonderfully long interview anyway. Listen, thank you so much. This has been How to Talk Policy and Influence People with me, Jane Mulcahy, and James Docherty in Glasgow. Thanks so much, James.
Thanks, Jane.